The sun scorched the dirt flat and dry. A young Japanese woman, barely in her 20s, gripped the branding iron with both hands, her sleeves rolled up, smoke curling from the seared hide of a steer. The cattle bawled. The cowboys watched. Her fingers ached, her face streaked with dust and sweat. But she didn't flinch. The branding iron hissed again. One cowboy spat chewing tobacco into the dust and said, almost admiringly, "They work like us." Another added, "Damn near tougher." Later that evening, the women sat cross-legged under the stars, plates of steak in their laps, the same meat they'd worked to raise, sear, and feed. The smell of charred beef drifted through the camp, mixing with the low hum of harmonicas and the sizzle of cast-iron pans. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't what they were told captivity would be either. In a land where they expected punishment, they found purpose. The West didn't break them, it fed them. The train had stopped somewhere dry and vast, and when the doors groaned open, the air that rushed in smelled not of coal smoke or rot, but of hay, manure, and heat. One woman, a former clerk from Nagasaki, squinted into the light and stepped down, her boots crunching against gravel. In the distance, beyond the roll of barbed wire and watchtowers, stretched a landscape they had no word for in Japanese, endless flat land dotted with cattle, fences, and the faint silhouette of horses. The Texas sun beat down hard. They had braced themselves for concrete walls, for screaming guards, for cages. Instead, they were met with the sight of ranch hands leaning against wooden rails, chewing straw, watching with calm, unreadable eyes. Their military uniforms, already torn and faded from weeks of transport, were taken from them at processing. In their place, they were handed canvas trousers, rough cotton shirts, and wide-brimmed hats that dwarfed their faces. The change felt humiliating at first, like being stripped of their last remnant of identity. But as they looked around and realized even the American workers wore the same clothes, something subtle shifted. They were no longer marked as soldiers or even prisoners. They were dressed like workers, like people. It was not kindness, exactly, but it was not mockery either. They were outfitted for labor, not punishment. The disorientation deepened with every step. The camp was ringed with barbed wire, yes, and there were armed guards posted at each gate. But inside, it looked less like a prison and more like a rough, self-contained village. Long wooden barracks stood in neat rows. Smoke curled from chimneys. A well-fed dog trotted lazily between the mess hall and the storage barn. The sky above was impossibly wide, a deep, punishing blue, nothing like the smoky skies they had left behind. At night, the silence was jarring. No bombs, no sirens, just cicadas and the soft whine of cattle beyond the fence. They were assigned duties almost immediately. Some were told to help in the mess, others to clean stalls, and a few were taken out into the pasture to watch and learn. The women, many of whom had never seen a cow up close, flinched at the size of the animals, their hooves thudding like drums against the dust. But the cowboys didn't shout. They gave short, clear instructions, spoken slowly in English and often pantomimed with patient hands. They didn't leer, they didn't smirk. When one woman fell trying to shovel hay, the cowboy beside her didn't laugh. He simply offered her the shovel again and nodded once. She stood up and kept working. It was in these early days that the emotional reversal began. Every woman in the camp had grown up with warnings. The Americans, they were told, were animals, demons. They would treat prisoners like insects, like toys to be broken. But these men, silent, sun-scorched, polite in a way that had no ceremony, seemed nothing like that. They spoke little, worked hard, and expected the same in return. If they were monsters, they were quiet ones, made of dust and denim and calloused hands. More than anything, it was the air that unnerved them. In Japan, even in the countryside, the sky felt close, held in by mountains or buildings. Here, it stretched so far in every direction that it made some women dizzy. There was no place to hide. The openness, both physical and emotional, left them exposed, not to violence, but to possibility. One woman, formerly stationed at a medical outpost in Manila, stood alone one morning outside the stables, her hand resting on a post worn smooth by wind. She stared at the horizon and whispered, "This is not a prison." The words felt dangerous, but it was the cowboys themselves that chipped away most at what they believed. They were not soft. Their boots were worn, their shirts sweat-stained, their faces hard and weathered. But they didn't sneer. When the women struggled to lift feed sacks, they showed them how to shift the weight to their hips. When one tried to lasso and failed, the cowboy simply handed the rope back and said, "Again." They offered no praise, but they also offered no shame. In the evenings, when the work was done and the light turned gold, some of the ranchers played harmonica or strummed guitars. They didn't talk much, but they let the women listen, and in that quiet music, in the smell of dust and horses, in the ache of tired muscles, the women began to wonder if the war had lied to them about everything. They had been trained to die before capture. Now, in the middle of cattle country, wearing borrowed hats and smelling like sweat and hay, they were starting to live. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the pasture and turned the sky the color of rust, the women were called to the mess area by a soft clang of a triangle bell. They moved cautiously, their steps hesitant, as if each one might set off the punishment they still expected. The mess wasn't a hall. It was a makeshift pavilion, open on all sides, with wooden tables and benches that faced the horizon. A cowboy in a dusty apron flipped steaks over a metal grill. The smell was sharp and rich, the fat hissing against the iron as the fire licked it clean. It struck like a memory from another life, of home, of warmth, of kitchens long gone. They had been told Americans would starve them, mock them, strip them of all decency. Instead, here they were being handed tin trays filled with baked beans, boiled potatoes slick with butter, thick slices of cornbread, and, most unbelievable of all, steak. Real steak, charred on the outside, pink at the center. One woman, a former nurse from Osaka, stared down at the meat as though it might vanish if she blinked. Her hands trembled. She looked up at the American cook. He gave a small nod, no smile, just a motion that said, "Go ahead." She sat on the edge of the bench, fork in hand, unmoving. Her hunger screamed. But so did something deeper, the shame. Eating meant accepting kindness. Accepting kindness meant lowering her guard, and yet her body decided before her mind did. The first bite broke something open, the salt, the smoke, the heat. She blinked fast, but the tears still came. She had not eaten this well in years. Across from her, another woman whispered, "This is a trick." But her voice lacked conviction. Another chewed in silence, eyes wide and wet. The food passed hand to hand, cornbread crumbling, beans spooned up slowly. They weren't speaking, not yet, but the air was different. The fear had not left, but it had changed shape. It was no longer about pain. It was about the unbearable idea that the enemy might be decent. This was not how honor was supposed to die. As they ate, the camp was quiet except for the distant sound of cattle and the low murmur of cowboys cleaning up the branding tools. The women stole glances at the guards, expecting them to laugh, to mock, to take the food away at the last moment. Instead, the Americans ate the same meals, shoulder to shoulder with one another, not watching the women, just eating, like it was normal, like it was no big thing to feed an enemy. The women had been taught that defeat came with degradation, but here they were given cloth napkins, water, a seat at a table, and somehow that was harder to swallow than any insult might have been. One woman sat frozen, steak half-eaten, as if the fork in her hand had turned to lead. She didn't say it aloud, but the question burned in her chest. If this is captivity, what does that make everything I fought for? After dinner, some of them lingered at the edge of the corral, watching the last of the cattle settle. A harmonica played faintly from one of the bunkhouses. The music didn't sound like victory or sorrow. It sounded like dusk settling over the prairie. Soft, indifferent, forgiving. That night, in their bunks, the women lay still under wool blankets that no longer scratched as much. Bellies full, muscles sore, hearts tangled. It was hard to explain, even to themselves, how much damage a hot meal could do to a belief system. Not the food, but what it implied, that they mattered, that their comfort had value, that the enemy had fed them not with smugness, but with quiet routine, as if it were just what people did. In the dark, someone whispered, "They don't hate us." No one answered, but no one disagreed. The next day they would wake again to cattle calls and sunburn, to more work and more silence. But something had cracked. The first crack never looks like revolution. It looks like steak on a plate. It looks like mercy where cruelty was promised. And once it's tasted, it cannot be untasted. The next morning the clang of the bell came before the sun had fully risen. The air was still cool, but already smelled of sweat, hay, and the damp scent of cattle. The women pulled on their work clothes without speaking. They had started moving in rhythm now, boots laced tight, sleeves rolled, hats pulled low. Some were assigned to the feeding sheds. Others were taken into the pasture. A smaller group, hand-picked, were led to the holding pens, where the branding irons waited. The first time they saw the irons glowing in the embers of the fire pit, most of them recoiled. Branding had always sounded cruel, almost ceremonial, something savage done to beasts. But the cowboys didn't treat it like a ritual. It was work, clean, fast, efficient. "You hold steady," one said, patting the shoulder of the woman beside him. "Don't flinch. The cow'll feel it, but it passes." He handed her the iron. She hesitated. Her hands, once used to typewriters and medical charts, now trembled as they wrapped around the long metal handle. The calf was pinned. The cowboy nodded. She stepped forward, knees locking, and pressed the iron down. The hiss was loud, the smell sharp and alive. She pulled back, chest heaving, the mark seared clean into the calf's flank. The cowboy said nothing, just nodded once. That nod, brief, restrained, but unmistakable, was her first recognition. She had done something that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the tasks multiplied. Feeding before sunrise, mending fence posts in the mid-morning heat, walking the perimeter of the pasture to check for breaks in the line, herding the cattle in pairs. They learned to whistle low and wave their arms in wide arcs, to guide the animals without panic. They learned to watch for signs of illness, drooping ears, a sluggish gait, discharge at the eyes. Some helped with birthing calves, elbow-deep in blood and mucus, gripping hooves with trembling fingers. It was work that reeked, blistered, and bruised, but it was also real. Their lives before had been dictated by commands, ranks, and rote obedience. As auxiliaries, they were treated as background noise to the machinery of war. But here, their labor left a mark, a literal one burned into hide. It wasn't just discipline, it was usefulness, a value that couldn't be faked or performed. The cowboys, for their part, remained mostly quiet. They gave instructions in short phrases, corrected without shouting, gestured more than they spoke, but slowly the space between guard and prisoner began to bend. Not in words, language remained a wall, but in glances, in the way a cowboy would hand off a tool without hesitation, in the way he'd step back and let the woman drive a post into the earth herself, in the way they started calling the women by shortened names, never cruel nicknames, just simpler ones they could pronounce. One evening, after a long branding session, the cowboy who'd first handed over the iron looked across the paddock and said, "They work like us." Another, leaning against the corral, nodded. "Tougher, maybe." The women didn't hear those words at the time, but they felt them somehow, in how the tools were passed to them, in how the tasks were no longer double-checked. Trust had entered the air like dust, quiet, ever-present, unspoken. Physical labor changed more than just their bodies. Their backs grew stronger, their hands rougher, their gait more grounded. But something inside changed too. At night, staring at the stars above the barracks roof, one woman thought to herself, "They trust us with the cattle, with their land, with their rhythm." She couldn't say why that mattered, but it did, deeply. Even in captivity, she had begun to feel legitimate, not in uniform, not in allegiance, but in effort, in sweat, in the heat of the iron. She had never thought she'd find pride in branding a calf. And yet, when she looked at her hands, calloused, cracked, sun-darkened, she saw something she had never been allowed to see before, her own worth. And maybe that was why, when the cowboy picked up a rusted horseshoe and offered it to her with a lopsided grin, she didn't look away. She was exhausted, her shirt clung to her back, her knees ached from kneeling in the dirt, but something about the way he tilted his head, not mocking but expectant, made her step forward. The others stood nearby, watching from the shade of the barracks. The cowboy drew a line in the dust with his boot and pointed toward a wooden stake hammered into the ground. "Try," he said simply. She held the horseshoe awkwardly, eyeing the target, then tossed. It arced wide, hitting the dirt with a dull thud nowhere near the post. The women giggled. She blushed, dropping her gaze, bracing for embarrassment. But the cowboy just let out a low whistle and clapped his hands once. "Again," he said, handing her another. This time her throw landed a little closer. The third toss curved in the air and landed with a satisfying clink near the stake. That small metallic sound drew a cheer from one of the other women. It was the first time she had heard someone clap for her since before the war. Soon more joined. One by one, Japanese prisoners and American ranchers lined up behind the dusty throwing line, taking turns with the bent old horseshoes. A few cowboys demonstrated exaggerated stances, widening their legs, squinting like actors, flinging wildly on purpose to draw laughs. The women, cautious at first, began to mimic their motions. One tossed the horseshoe so forcefully it flew past the target and landed at a cowboy's feet. He threw his hands in the air in mock terror. She covered her face in horror, then laughed, full-throated, uncontrollable laughter. It was a sound that startled even her. And then the impossible happened. They were all laughing. No orders, no watchful silence, no divisions, at least not in that hour. Just red dirt, tired muscles, and a game under the fading sun. The sky turned a soft orange. Somewhere, a radio crackled faintly from the mess hall window, tinny country music floating over the scene like background music in a dream. It was absurd. These were prisoners of war. These were American soldiers. They had been raised on opposing ideas of honor and loyalty, fed opposite stories of cruelty and righteousness, and yet here they were, cheering each other's throws, teasing, shrugging, smiling. The world that had drawn their boundaries had vanished for an evening. Later, one of the older women sat on the barracks steps, watching two cowboys still throwing back and forth in the dark. "We must be ghosts," she said to no one, "because this feels like the afterlife." Another woman sat beside her, silent. Then she murmured, "Maybe it's just the world, when the war forgets about us." That night, as they settled into their bunks, dust still clinging to their collars, something clung to them that was harder to shake than sweat or soil: normalcy. The shocking realization that for a few minutes they hadn't felt like prisoners. They'd felt like people. For so long, captivity had meant silence, ritual, fear. But now there were moments unscripted, laughter that didn't come from cruelty, competition without command. The game of horseshoes wasn't sanctioned by Geneva or planned by any superior officer. It happened simply because a cowboy looked at a woman, saw the sunburn on her face, the tired set of her shoulders, and thought, "She needs to throw something." And maybe he did too. The simplicity of that truth was almost more dangerous than any weapon, because what it suggested was unbearable, that peace wasn't made in treaties, but in shared moments over rusted horseshoes. That reconciliation could begin with a game, with laughter, with the discovery that even on opposite sides of a war, the human desire to laugh, to connect, to forget the walls for one night, was stronger than propaganda. They were still prisoners. The war was not over. But that evening left a mark not unlike the ones they had pressed into cattle flesh. It was not loud, not visible, but burned just as deep. A memory that hummed beneath the silence of the following day, a reminder that even here, in a camp designed to contain, something had escaped: hope. It lingered like smoke after a long fire, thin and fragile, but impossible to stamp out. The next week, the women were called into the recreation hall, a low wooden structure that still smelled faintly of hay and kerosene. Inside, a table had been set with neat stacks of paper, dull pencils, and small envelopes. A sign written in English and halting Japanese announced, "Write to your families." The words sent a murmur through the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the cowboys, standing by the door, simply said, "Go on." His voice was calm, almost casual, as if offering them coffee rather than a lifeline. The women approached the table like it might vanish if they stepped too quickly. Each took a sheet. The paper felt impossibly clean beneath their fingertips, white, smooth, smelling faintly of sawdust and glue. Some stared at it for long minutes, unmoving. Others began to write, their strokes stiff and cautious at first. What could they say? That they had laughed with Americans? That the guards had played games and shared meals? That there were cows grazing freely beyond the wire? That they had eaten steak until they were full? To admit such things would sound like betrayal, not survival. In their minds still lingered the image of Japan, their mothers rationing rice into cups the size of a fist, their fathers' faces hollowed by hunger. They pictured cities bombed into dust, children picking bark from trees to fill their stomachs. And here they were, prisoners of war, writing letters with full bellies. One woman began with the safest words, "I am alive." The pencil trembled in her hand. She wanted to write that she was treated kindly, but that word, kindly, felt too large, too impossible. It was as if her country might dissolve upon reading it. So she wrote instead, "I am well." She hesitated, then added, "We work every day." That was true, though it said nothing of laughter or steak or horseshoes. Others wrote in fragments, half-truths and fragments of prayers. "The Americans give us tasks. The air is dry here. The nights are quiet. A few women folded their letters immediately, sealing them quickly before temptation could lead them to honesty. Others kept writing, their thoughts spilling out like water breaking through a cracked dam. These were not letters anymore. They were confessions disguised as correspondence. One woman, who had once been a teacher, filled an entire page describing the cattle she tended each morning. She wrote about their soft noses, their heavy breaths, the way they chewed patiently without fear. "They live better than our people now," she wrote, then froze, realizing what she had said. That line would never pass censorship. Still, she left it there as if to remind herself that truth had weight, even if unseen. When the guards collected the letters, the women watched their envelopes disappear into canvas sacks, unsure whether they would ever reach Japan. Some knew they wouldn't. The military censors would intercept them, strip them of dangerous details, file them away in drawers marked propaganda risk. But the act of writing itself felt sacred. It was not about communication. It was reclamation, a return to the idea that their voices mattered. That night, when the camp fell quiet, a few women sat awake by the window slats, clutching scraps of unused paper. They began writing again, not letters this time, but diaries. They wrote by moonlight, whispering their words like secrets. One described the smell of the prairie after rain. Another described the sound of cowboys singing by the fire. A third confessed that she no longer hated the enemy. She didn't love them, but the hatred had gone out of her like a tide receding from the shore. There was guilt in these pages. Shame, too. How could they explain to their families that captivity had given them peace, that the war had to end for them to understand humanity? They feared no one would believe them, that when they returned people would call them weak, collaborators, tainted by the enemy's mercy. Still, they wrote, because silence had been their weapon once, and it had failed them. Words, even forbidden ones, were a new kind of freedom. When dawn came, they hid the diaries beneath their mattresses, between folded clothes, under straw. The guards would never find them. These pages were not meant for any censor, any officer, or even for the families who might never read their names again. They were meant for the future, the version of themselves that would survive the war, carrying these truths like hidden embers. In a place where they were supposed to be broken, they had begun to rebuild themselves, one word at a time. By now, their hands were calloused. Some had tan lines from the sun. They smelled of leather, manure, and sweat. But they walked taller. The labor had not degraded them. It had given them something they didn't know they were allowed to have: dignity without suffering. They were captives, yes, but no longer humiliated. The cowboys' praise came sparingly, but when it did, it struck deeper than any military medal. The changes began at the surface. Small things at first, a more grounded stride, muscles that no longer trembled under the weight of a feed sack, arms firmed from fence repair, fingers blackened by rope and ash. They had arrived thin, brittle, carrying their shame like invisible wounds stitched into their skin. Now their bodies spoke another language, one of resilience that couldn't be taken by rank or ideology. They looked less like prisoners and more like people who worked the land. And, in many ways, they were. The mirror, when they dared look into it, no longer reflected the enemy of Allied propaganda or the dishonored failure of Japanese surrender. It reflected someone they had never been allowed to see before, a woman who endured, a woman who belonged to herself, if only for the length of a single breath. For most of them, that was a new experience. When a cowboy passed and said, "Good hand today," it was only 2 words, but it landed with the weight of an honor badge, not because of the praise itself, but because of what it acknowledged: that her effort had meaning. She had not been spared out of pity. She had earned respect by doing the same work, sweating under the same sun. No bow, no title, no chant to the emperor, just a nod, a glance, and the knowledge that she had pulled her own weight that day. They were not treated like soldiers anymore, not even like enemies. They were workers, not above the cattle, but not beneath them either. They were part of the cycle now: brand, feed, care, repeat. And with each day, the American guards stopped watching them like potential threats. Instead, they moved among them with quiet confidence, handing them tools, trusting they'd know how to use them. The fear that once hung between the two groups like thick fog had lifted. In its place was dust. Dust that clung to skin, lined their clothes, got caught in the creases of their eyes, but never felt like filth. It was honest, earned. That shift, subtle but seismic, began to erode the shame that had followed them off the boats, the shame they'd been told to wear forever, like a second skin. The shame of surviving what they were supposed to die, resisting. But here, among horses and herds and fire-pit meals, that shame started to feel misplaced. If this was dishonor, then why did it feel so right? One woman, once a courier in the Philippines, said quietly to another while mending a saddle strap, "They never call us prisoners." The other woman paused, thinking. "They call us girls," she replied, "or workers." And that was true. They'd gone days, weeks even, without hearing the word prisoner. Not from the guards, not from the cowboys, not even from the officers who came to inspect the camp. To be called a worker meant they had value, not for what they represented, but for what they could do, for their effort, their rhythm, their grit. And in a war built on symbols, flags, empires, ideologies, that simple, human recognition carried more weight than any doctrine. In the evenings, when they scrubbed dirt from beneath their nails, they no longer rushed to clean themselves of it. The dust was not something to be ashamed of. It was proof they had mattered that day, that their sweat had soaked the same soil as the men who once eyed them with suspicion, that their place in this strange, sunburned world was real. American captivity had not undone them. It had revealed something they'd been denied by their own army, by their own nation, the right to exist without needing to suffer to prove their worth, the right to be seen not as tools or liabilities, but as individuals. And once that dignity took root, it was impossible to rip out, even behind fences, even under guard, because what they had found here was not just survival. It was a kind of belonging that had never needed a uniform. Riding in the back of a supply truck to a nearby ranch, a woman stared at rolling fields dotted with cattle. No ruins, no craters, no collapsed roofs, just land, sun, and open air. She blinked back tears. In her homeland, children ate bark, and buildings groaned under ash. Here the earth still produced. That abundance was not only physical, it was philosophical, and it made her wonder, what kind of country treats its enemies like neighbors? The truck jostled over a dirt road, past stretches of pasture framed by wooden fences, and she clung to the side rail not out of fear, but to steady herself in a world that refused to collapse. Behind her, another prisoner leaned forward and whispered, "No rubble?" It wasn't a question. It was a confession of disbelief. The wind blew through their hair, and the smell of grass, sweet and sun-warmed, filled the truck bed like a perfume from another planet. In Japan, the scent of life had been replaced by smoke. Her last memory before capture was the shriek of sirens and the long hiss of something burning that would not go out. In the cities there were no longer seasons, just ash that fell like snow, windows shattered by pressure waves, and silence that always came too late. Here, even the silence sounded different. It was not hollow. It was peaceful. They passed a white farmhouse with a porch swing. A child ran through the yard, barefoot, chasing a chicken. The women watched in silence, no one speaking, each gripped by the image like it was a hallucination. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. The war had not touched this land, or if it had passed like a breeze, not a hurricane. Later, when they arrived at the sister ranch, the woman stepped down from the truck and stared at a rusted tractor, its wheels half buried in tall grass. She knelt, almost without thinking, and touched the dirt. It was warm, alive, growing. She had not felt living soil in years, and she wondered, how could the enemy live like this while her country cracked and starved? That question didn't go away. Back at camp, the contrast became unbearable in moments both small and crushing. The mess hall trays, stacked with cornbread, beans, and cuts of beef, looked obscene when she thought of her mother boiling roots in a tin pot. The buckets of clean water made her think of Tokyo women crouching by broken pipes, catching drips in their palms. Even the camp's smallest library, with its worn paperbacks and English dictionaries, felt like a luxury her school in Osaka had never known. She began to realize that the war had not just divided nations by language or allegiance, it had divided them by reality. Japan had waged a war of desperation, clinging to old myths of honor and sacrifice. America, somehow, had waged a war from abundance. It had sent its sons to die overseas, but its fields still grew, its cows still grazed, its children still ran barefoot in the sun. The moral terrain shifted beneath her feet. She had been raised to believe in purity through suffering, that only through endurance and submission could one find honor. But here, suffering was not sanctified. It was avoided. Cattle were fed to be strong, not starved into discipline. Workers were paid to rest, not broken by toil. Even prisoners were granted dignity, not because they had earned it, but because this land seemed to believe they deserved it by existing. One night she lay in bed listening to the sound of frogs chirping near the irrigation ditch. The stars outside the barracks window were sharp, unclouded by smoke. She whispered, "It was never equal." She wasn't speaking to anyone, just to the night, just to the idea of a world she no longer understood. Because this war, she now saw, had not been fought on equal footing, not just in weapons or factories or fleets, but in how each side viewed life itself. One side saw death as sacred, the other, somehow, had made room for mercy. And that mercy, soft as prairie wind and sharp as cattle wire, was starting to change her. Not into something weaker, but into something terrifyingly strong. A person who could admit that her enemy might have been right, not in war, but in what came after it. She pulled the blanket tighter and turned her face toward the window. The stars still burned. The land was still alive, and for the first time she allowed herself to want something more than endurance. She wanted a world like this, one that did not need to be rebuilt from ash, one that had never burned. The whisper came first, passed from bunk to bunk, mumbled near the water barrels, repeated over dinner trays in voices too soft for the guards to hear. Japan is surrendering. Some said the emperor had already spoken. Others insisted it couldn't be true. But the signs multiplied. Fewer inspections. A sudden quiet from the officers' building. American guards with solemn faces, their posture less rigid. Then one day, a new word floated across the compound like smoke. Repatriation. It should have been a relief, an end to fences, a return home. But the word tasted strange in their mouths, bitter, unfinished. Home wasn't what it had been, and they were no longer who they were. That evening in the mess hall, as beef stew steamed gently on their trays, one woman set down her spoon and whispered, "They'll think we betrayed them." Across from her, another woman stared at her food, then said, "But we were fed." Their eyes met. Neither smiled. The guilt came quietly, curling at the edges of their thoughts like smoke under a door. It wasn't just the shame of surviving. It was surviving well. They had expected bruises, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they would return with stronger bodies, pink in the cheeks, hair thick again, arms firm from honest work. They had lived, not barely, but fully. They had eaten steak. They had laughed. They had slept without fear. And now that life felt like something dangerous to carry across the ocean. One woman tried to write home again, but this time she paused before describing the meals. She crossed out hot bread and replaced it with food. She removed soft mattress entirely. The truth was too generous, too treasonous. Because outside these barbed fences, her mother might be boiling roots. Her brother might have died hungry. And who would forgive her for gaining weight while her country starved? Some prisoners began to retreat into silence. They avoided the cowboys now, unsure how to say goodbye, unsure if they wanted to. One woman wept alone in the stables after feeding a calf, its warm breath on her hands reminding her of something innocent and unspoken. Another folded her work shirt slowly at night, as if by caring for it she could delay what came next. Because what came next was not just a boat ride, it was a reckoning. Captivity had changed them, not just their habits but their sense of self. They had entered the camp expecting cruelty and had instead been shown something far more disorienting: kindness, work, music, recognition. They had been seen, fed, given tools and trust, and in return they had rebuilt parts of themselves they didn't know had crumbled. But could that truth survive back home? Would their families recognize them? Would their commanders, their neighbors, their husbands? Could they say, "Yes, I was a prisoner, but I was treated like a person"? Or would they be forced to bury it all, pretend they had suffered more, smile thinly when asked about the camps? The question hung in the air like dust at dusk. Was this dignity a gift or a burden? Have you ever heard this story before? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And while you're down there, click the like button, subscribe, you'll find it just under this video, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story like this. Your support helps us keep digging into forgotten voices from history, stories that deserve to be heard. That night, as the prairie wind swept over the fence lines, one woman opened her hidden diary and wrote only one line, "I am afraid to go home." She stared at the words, then closed the book and slid it under her mattress. It was the first time she had feared the world outside the camp more than the world within it. And maybe that was the final irony of it all, that in a prison she had learned what it meant to be free. The fire snapped softly as the sun vanished behind the hills, leaving the prairie bathed in indigo and silence. A long table had been dragged out beside the corral, its surface worn smooth by use, now dressed with tin plates and pitchers of water. There were no announcements, no orders barked, no ceremony. Just the quiet shuffle of boots on dirt and the low hiss of steak searing on an open grill. The cowboys were cooking, and the women knew, without needing to be told, that this would be the last time. The air smelled of salt and smoke, with a touch of pine carried on the wind. They sat shoulder to shoulder, Japanese prisoners and American guards, not speaking much, but not needing to. There was a sacredness in the quiet, in the rhythm of forks scraping plates, in the way eyes met and then turned away again. This was not a celebration. It was something softer, something heavier, a farewell wrapped in the rituals of food and firelight. One woman, her cheeks warmed by both the flames and a strange kind of grief, bit into a piece of steak and held it on her tongue, savoring it as if it were the last taste she would ever remember. The meat was rich, thick with pepper, cooked just slightly past rare. She closed her eyes and breathed through her nose, forcing herself to memorize it, not just the flavor, but the moment. Around her, the others did the same. No one said it, but all of them understood that this would live longer in memory than most things from the war. A cowboy tuned his guitar with thick fingers, then began to strum a slow, wandering melody. A guard pulled a harmonica from his pocket and, after a pause, handed it across the table to one of the women. She blinked, startled, then smiled, small, shy, and raised the instrument to her lips. The first note wobbled, thin and unsure. The second steadied, and by the third, something like music floated over the camp. Not perfect, but real. It was absurd if you looked at it from the outside. Captors and prisoners eating the same meal, listening to the same tune, bathed in the same starlight. But for those who had lived this story from the inside, it made more sense than the war itself ever had. There was no need for speeches. Every bite of food, every pluck of a string, was already saying everything words could not. No one toasted, no one said thank you. But the gratitude was thick in the air, unspoken and undeniable. One woman, a former translator from Kyoto, stared into the fire and felt her chest ache. She remembered the ashes of her childhood street. Her brother's empty shoes by the door, her mother folding a shirt that would never be worn again. And yet here, in a foreign land built on grass and cattle and strangers who'd shown her more humanity than her own officers ever had, she felt strangely complete, not healed, but whole in a way she had never expected to be. She realized with a quiet certainty that this ranch, this camp, had given her something Japan never did, a space to be simply herself. Not a tool, not a servant of empire, just a woman with hands, hunger, and a name someone had learned to pronounce. The fire burned low, the plates emptied, the harmonica fell silent. A cowboy stood, stretched his back, and without a word began folding up the benches. The spell broke, but gently. One by one the women rose, brushing crumbs from their laps. Glancing at the guards with half-smiles that said everything and nothing. There would be a train soon, then a ship, then a return to a place that no longer felt like home. But tonight, this quiet, starlit night on the edge of nowhere, they had been something more than the sum of their stories. They had been human together. Back in Japan, the cattle brand on her boots remained faint but visible, a darkened curve, like a whisper pressed into worn leather. She hadn't noticed it until she unpacked the satchel they'd let her bring home, one of the few things she could carry off the ship. The boots had traveled across 2 oceans, through customs and suspicion, through her own trembling hands as she stepped back onto soil that had once meant safety. But that brand, pressed there during a morning of work months before, had stayed. It wasn't fire anymore. It was memory. Her village was rubble now. Half the rooftops were gone, the market square collapsed in on itself, and the temple bell she'd once rung as a girl lay cracked beneath a cherry tree stripped of blossoms. Children ran barefoot through the streets with stomachs bloated by hunger. Her mother stared at her as if through fog, then wept. Not with joy, but with confusion. "You're strong," she whispered, touching her daughter's shoulders as if strength were shame. And maybe it was. She had returned with full cheeks, sunburnt skin, a straight spine. In a nation of ghosts, she looked alive, and in that there was something unforgivable. She did not speak of the stake, of the Cowboys, of the game of horseshoes played beneath a sunset. She did not speak of laughter or music or the soft way someone had handed her a canteen after a branding session, without words, without judgment. There was no space in Japan for that story, no category for it, only silence. But she remembered, not just with her mind, but in her bones. Her muscles still moved with the rhythm of the ranch. Her hands still knew the heft of rope and the heat of cattle breath, and her heart, God help her, still beat slower when she remembered the prairie wind. It wasn't nostalgia, it wasn't betrayal, it was something harder to explain, that she had found a kind of grace in the last place she expected. The contradiction of it threatened to split her in two. She had been told to despise the enemy, to see surrender as erasure, but she had not been erased. She had been marked, not with shame, but with dignity. She had been given the tools of labor, the space to breathe, and a name spoken without disdain. Not prisoner, not Jap, just worker, just girl, just you. She never wore the boots again, but she never threw them out. She kept them in a wooden box beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth. Sometimes, on nights when the rain beat hard against the broken roof, she would lift the lid, run her fingers over the worn leather, and feel that faint ridge beneath her thumb. The brand. Proof that somewhere across the ocean someone had looked at her and said, "They work like us." The war had ended, but the kindness had not. It lived on, not in monuments or parades, but in quiet rituals, in how she helped her neighbor patch a roof without being asked, in how she gave her rice portion to a hungry child, in how she once held a crying widow's hand and said, "We are still here." That kindness hadn't come from an emperor. It had come from a cowboy who handed her a tool and didn't flinch. She never spoke of the camp. Not fully, not honestly, but in the soft way she moved through the world afterward, something had shifted. She no longer carried herself as broken. She carried herself as branded, not by violence, but by mercy. It was not the brand of cattle. It was the brand of having been seen in the dust and heat of a war's aftershock as human. And that, more than any flag, more than any oath or anthem, stayed with her. Unshakable, undeniable, a mark that never needed fire to burn.